I just sort of have to say once that, you know, teaching really late at night is not my first choice, because I'm an early bed person, right? I have little kids, wake up early, and all that kind of stuff. So please be, like I said in the syllabus, please be respectful to me and to your colleagues and your peers by not surfing the internet, texting, doing stuff that's inappropriate or that's not, and by inappropriate I mean not directly related to what we're doing right here in class, because I find it very distracting. It's very obvious when you look out and you're working really hard at 9:30 at night to make everything interesting, and then somebody's like doing something else. It like stops me and I can't remember where I was at. Okay? So just not good for you, not good for me, not good for the people next to you. Let's just not do it. You're paying way too much money to waste your time. Okay, so I'm just going to start with this painting. This is a painting by Margaret Lazari, who's a friend of mine here at USC. She's the chair of the Fine Arts Department. And I love this painting as a place to start when you're thinking about sort of human development as a broad field. So what this actually is, if you look, in real life this painting is like 6 by 8 feet, and it's this vibrant watercolor that is just huge and incredibly intense colors. And it doesn't show up that well in the photo, but it's the best we can do. If you kind of squint and look at the center of this seascape that she's painted, you see these white squiggly things, right? My dog thinks they look like clouds. I think they look like waves. What they actually are, do I have a guess? Okay, what? Chromosomes? Oh, that's a guess. Right, like the DNA when you pull it apart from the cell? That actually looks a little like that. That's not what it is.
Prefrontal cortex?
Not exactly, but you're sort of on the road. What it actually is neuroimaging data from one brave woman, right, who basically went in our scanner and let us take pictures of her brain. So we took anatomical pictures, and then what we did is we stripped off all the neurons around the outside of her cortex, right? So there's a little thin sheath of cells that are kind of the ones that we think sort of do the thinking and the firing. We peel those all off, like off the picture, not off the lady, right? And then, you don't know, you gotta say it. And then what's left is all the billions of little tails, right, of those neurons, the microscopic little tubes of salt water, basically, that connect in these incredibly dynamic and complex networks around the entire head, basically. And these networks, we're now learning, are one of the major sort of organized features of the human brain and of other brains. And you read a little bit about this to prepare for today. Although I will point out also that throughout history, right, whatever technology we're currently developing is also our metaphor for biology, right? You start with hydraulics, like way back when, and then you move into, all these things like telephones, where you've got neurons sending signals back and forth, and now we're into, then we had computers where you put input and it comes out with output, right, in the 60s, and now we're into networks, and that's where we got that idea from, right? But it's actually really interesting, because now we're starting to understand the brain's function, not just as a bunch of little localized places that are sort of talking to each other, but as really interrelated, interconnected cells that are speaking to each other in much more, and influencing one another in much more dynamic and complex ways than we really had ever imagined. The first of these networks, like the default mode network, the resting state network, so-called, that you read about for today, was only first really described in 2001. And at that point, they didn't really know what it was yet. And we'll talk about this, but I mean, this stuff is very new. And now it's pretty clear that the brain is organized into many, many layered dynamic networks, and many locations in the brain are actually part of several networks and they're switching off with one another in these sort of dynamic interactions that allow you to be who you are. They're shaped by your biology, they're shaped by your health, they're shaped by your genetics, and not by your epigenetics, which we're going to learn something about later on tonight. And so what I love about this painting is that Margaret's painted all of that, which is basically the sum total of this woman's ability to be herself, right? Everything that she knows, everything that she's learned, everything that she remembers, everything that she's lived by virtue of her own experience of the world, right? Not just what's happened to her, but how she interpreted that and remembers it and makes meaning of it. All that sort of floating in this seascape of lives. So oftentimes we think of biology and person as kind of separate things, right? We have a person, and I know I'm not just my biology, whatever that's supposed to mean, right? And then also we've got, these kids who come into our classrooms, or these learners who come to our universities, or whatever at whatever level you're teaching, and we've got basically this notion that you have a certain kind of brain that you bring and you sort of put it there in the chair and then, you know, you kind of poke at it and see what it can do, and that's the kind of brain you've got in front of you, right? You've got a dyslexic brain or a happy brain or whatever kind of brain. And in actuality, I really like to think about it much more like this. And this is why it's actually even relevant to bring neuroscience into the study of human development, is because the developmental context, the whole rest of the world is sort of literally sloshing back and forth and bolstering up and, you know, supporting that sort of semi-translucent set of connections around this person's head. And she's got, you know, the sun shining down on the top of this, warming it, and she's got little weeds growing up through the bottom of it, and she's got little red fish swimming by to represent the spontaneity of our creative ideas. And this is how I like to think about human beings. This is how I like to think about the study of human development, as trying to understand how this entire system is working. Both how the brain is making a mind and how the mind is being sloshed back and forth and held up and shaped by the environment around it, and how that environment is also representing who we are as we interact with it. We're changing our own environments and also being changed by them in this incredibly dynamic system kind of way of thinking. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions or comments? Anybody else see something different in here? There's lots to see, right? But
would you say then, if you're meditating, that's the type of image that you would have?
okay, so if you're meditating, that's actually very meditating it induces a brain state that's related to the default mode that you read about, right? It's this kind of internally focused brain state. It's, I don't think, an accident that when you're teaching someone, a novice, to meditate, what do you do first? What's the easiest thing to focus on? Your breath, your heartbeat, right? Internal visceral sensations. We're going to talk about why that is, because this network is actually visceral interoceptive. When you turn away from the world and you go in, what do you have? You've got your own physiology on the inside, right? And that gives you information about how you're doing and how you're kind of acting in the world and how you're feeling and how well you are, right? And so, does that kind of answer your question? So meditation is associated with particular kinds of brain states. It's also capable of changing the brain in certain ways, and people are very actively studying that. Other questions or ideas? So, I hear a lot of, like what is that? First of all, let me just point out, what is that?
Biology.
Well, yeah, it's your social mind playing out the meaning of something involuntarily on your biological regulation, right? I mean, those little sighs and like the looks on your face and like your heartbeat's probably slowing down a little bit, like, you know, your blood pressure is going down a little bit when you watch a photo like this. All of that is your aware, cognitive mind interpreting information and playing out its meaning on your own, basically your own physiological regulation. Let's point that out. Right? You're changing your breathing. You're changing your heartbeat. You're changing very basic things about your own physiological regulation, what we call homeostasis, right? The basic physiological regulation that keeps you alive. Things like breathing, you can't live without those. And what's interesting is that you're giving away is that when we study how people develop, how people grow, how people become who they are, this is why it doesn't make sense to me to study the mind and to study the social world without also understanding the biological context as well. Because what we're learning is that our social mind and our cognitive mind, right, are intertwined with, they're playing out the meaning and the interpretation and your reactions to situations and the learning in a kind of broad sense by actually co-opting and modulating the very basic physiological regulatory systems whose job it is to keep you alive. This isn't just metaphor, right? You're kind of demonstrating it in a kind of cute way, but I'll actually show you later the brain data to show that this is really sort of biologically true. We can see activations in people's brain stem, all the way at the bottom, right above their spinal cord, in regions that if you damage those, we can't even keep you alive on life support because your heart doesn't beat, short of defibrillating it with every beat. You become completely dysregulated as an organism and you can't live. And yet we're activating those regions when we're engaged in social relationships, or even when we're engaged as an adult in thinking about the psychological qualities of another person's mind and what those mean to us. So to me, the biology and the sociocultural sort of development, the biological and the sociocultural development are totally shaping and intertwined with one another. And that's why it's so interesting to understand, for example, how community violence, or even knowledge about community violence, might shape how an adolescent feels their own self, how healthy they are, for example. Or how they make meaning about the world. But how they make meaning about the world and who they think they are and why people do these things and what they should do is also tied to the way in which they experience these actions. And these actions are experienced, just like you experience this photograph, on the substrate of your own physiological regulation. They're playing that out also, and it's changing literally, biologically, who they are. Comments? Just feel free to ask at any point. Also, like I said before, but some of you might have missed it, I don't mind at all if people stand up and walk to the back and watch back there for a while, or you don't have to sit still the whole time, I don't mind. And you can also interrupt me. Okay. So what is this picture a picture of that made you all sigh contentedly and smile? It's a baby.
Very new baby.
It's a very new baby.
You're about to have one.
It's a grandbaby. If you're about to have one, yeah, you might see your own situation in the photo. Exactly. It's, what was it, Erin?
It's an interaction happening.
It's an interaction.
Bonding.
Yeah, an interaction that's causing a kind of bonding. And that bonding is at once sort of cultural and social, right? The way in which she's holding the baby and talking to the baby and interacting with the baby is very cultural. Like, that's not done universally around the world. It's done in different ways in different places, right? No natural, healthy human society, though, doesn't bond with their infants. That never happens. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. But in every society, there might be various ways of doing this. Like, you might strap your child to your back, or you might give your child to older siblings to care for, or you might pass the child around to all the women in your group to nurse or something like that. But always children are cared for and accepted into their family group, however that family group is organized, right? So what I really love about this photograph, so this, first of all, is my sister. It's not me. I never put pictures of myself in anything. You'll see my kids, you'll see my friends, you'll see my sisters, you'll see my brother, you'll see everybody over the course of the class, okay? But it just stays here, okay? That's why I don't post these slides too. So what you can see is that this is my sister, and this is my little niece, Nina. And in this picture, Nina is about 2 hours old, and she was the smaller of two twins, and she was born in an emergency C-section. So basically both my sister was anesthetized under general anesthesia, and so the babies were too, right? So everybody was sleeping when they were born. And so this is the first time, about 2 hours later, when they were both awake enough that they could actually meet and interact with each other. So it's the first time they've really met each other, when they're both awake. And there are so many ways in which you could talk about this picture, but what I really love as a jumping off point for the study of human development is to kind of note that sort of this is where it starts, right? And what you can see here is at once extremely social, right? Intensely social. It's the formation of arguably a child's most important early bond, right? With their parent, and the parent's most important bond at that point in their life. And yet, we can also see the biological substrate of this at the same time. You can analyze it at many different levels. So if you look at this, my sister is helping Nina in every way possible. She's supporting every aspect of her behavior at that moment that can be supported from the outside. She's holding her head at exactly the right level. Hi. To be able to, here's some seats over here. Will you be able to see? She's holding her at exactly the right, sort of shape so that she can see up. She's supporting her little hands, which are so tonic right there that Nina can really only sort of do one thing at a time. It's very hard to manage any kind of complex skill when you're 2 hours old. But she has things she can do. What can she do? What is she doing? She can look, right? So that baby comes to the world, assuming she's sort of a typically developing normal child, she comes to the world with a biological predisposition built genetically into her visual system in her brain that makes her look for and stare at two black dots in this kind of configuration. right? Not this configuration, not 3 of them, not them too far apart, 2 dark dots like this. And then that biological reflex, which is just a reflex, you can trick a baby into doing this with just 2 dark pieces of paper or 2 pens or anything, right? That reflex gets elicited in the context of a social interaction and becomes her entry point into her first early skill that will then sort of pull her into the human social world, right? So she starts with this kind of just, I can see black dots and I stare at them, and then from there, that's her ability to kind of come into a social interaction, and then it builds from there over the course of her lifetime. So it's biological, and it's also elicited in the context of a social interaction. It's supported in the context of a social interaction. And notice that, did somebody take my sister aside and remind her that, if you want optimal development for your newborn infant, newborn children do not see very well yet. Their eyes don't focus very well. They don't foveate very well. So you want about an 8 to 10, inch, distance if you're going to optimize what they can do in their learning environment. So let's get out the ruler and we're just going to, of course not, right? How does she know, just sort of instinctively, non-consciously, to hold Nina at exactly the right distance where Nina can see? How does she know that? It's actually a question, it's not a rhetorical one.
Have tradition, haven't seen someone do it before.
She may have seen other people do it before.
Because she experienced the same, possibly?
But possibly she's also lived it, right?
Maybe a physiological desire for proximity.
Yeah, right? So she's actually physiologically sort of drawn to the baby? And did we say?
Oh, it's also biology. That's her arm length.
It's kind of her arm length, that's true, right? So it would be a real bummer if infants could only see you when you're 10 feet away, right? That wouldn't work very well, evolutionarily speaking, exactly. And also because I think Nina, what were you gonna say?
I was going to say instincts to some extent.
Right, but where's that instinct coming from? She's adjusting in real time to make this right for the baby, right? If you think about this, is just a photo, but you can imagine if this was a video or a real world situation, she wouldn't stay like this infinitely. She'd be always like sort of adjusting and noticing, well, you notice like Nina's not hungry right now. She's not cold. She's not sleeping, right? She's not upset. That wouldn't be the time to try this, right? She's sort of setting up the whole context in order for Nina to be able to sort of optimally do what she's, capable of in what we call a really high support condition. When everything else is set up, she can do this one thing right now, which is look at somebody's face. Somebody over here was going to say something.
I was just going to say that she probably notices her eyes being fixed to her,
Exactly. So I think non-consciously also, my sister is getting feedback from the baby. The baby is looking going, whoa, I don't see anything, right? Oh, there you are, right? And you get her a little too close, it's like, woo, So she's adjusting based on the baby's behavior so that she can sort of give and take and make that, adapt the situation so that it's optimally supporting what that baby's is able to do in that moment. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So do you see how this is it's at once a cognitive thing, right? She's calculating and adjusting all the time. And so is Nina. Nina is looking for dots. That's a cognitive skill. It's a sort of proto-cognitive skill. But that, reflex is being elicited for an emotional end, for a kind of social bond that's going to be the basis for future learning and safety and relationships and feeding and everything else. So it's at once kind of biological and cognitive and social and cultural, all in one big interaction. Anybody have comments or disagree or agree or have something else to add?
She looks really good for having a 2-hour-old.
I know, yeah, she kind of does. I think the blouse is sort of, fluffing over, but yes, that's true. It's hard for me to see you guys with the bright windows in the back, so I'm sorry if I'm sort of squinting at you. Anybody else have anything to add?
I mean, it's also, like, when I look at the pictures, also the context of them being in the hospital, and that's, like, maybe a very, somewhat Western.
Yes, definitely.
Like, if Nina was born in another society, she might not have been in the hospital.
Right, exactly, or on that pillow, or with that kind of pink clothing, like, all that stuff is very cultural, right? In fact, next week when we study infancy, we're going to actually look at, have you seen that movie, Babies? you go. So we'll look through, bits of that, because it's a terrific, example. I don't know how realistic it is since they went around with a team of, photographers. But it's nice to see the different, settings in which infants are sort of brought into families in different places in the world, right? Okay. So this is Dorothea. She's one of my friends, one of my cohort members from my graduate school's child. And my friend Kim sent me this picture of Dorothea with her grandma. And I said, can I use this for development class? And she said, sure. So what's going on here? First of all, how old is Dorothea? It's pretty hard to be younger than Nina, but about 2 months. 2.5 months, exactly. So how do you know that she's older here? What's the same and what's different? What has Dorothea learned, quote unquote, developed to be able to do? What skill does she have now that Nina didn't have yet? And what do they both have in common that Nina already had? So they're both mirroring, exactly. Next week we're going to look at videos of mirroring and really start to pick that phenomenon apart. Exactly, so, and I couldn't see who said it. Was it you, Daryl? Are you
No.
Daryl? Who are you?
Daryl.
Daryl, oh, that's right, I shouldn't have said anything. I was all right. So they're mirroring each other, right? You can see that they're matching each other's mouth, right? And probably if this weren't a still image, they'd be like cooing at each other, going, ooh, making little noises back and forth. So they're vocalizing at each other. They're gazing into each other's eyes. Oh, you're just going.
Sorry.
Okay, no, that's okay. And still, Grandma is supporting Dorothea, but now, notice she's got her at the right distance so she can see, and she's holding her a little bit up, and she's supporting the whole bottom half of Dorothea, right? Because, development happens from the top down. You start with your head and your arms, and you go down to your feet last, right? You can use your hands before you can use your feet as an infant, okay? And as an elderly person, you lose your feet before you lose your hands, okay? So this part is still very primitive in motor control. I mean, she doesn't have good control over here, but, thank you very much. Just like one arm I can express my enthusiasm with. Okay, so there's actually, the way we can think about this is there's a lot the same. Dorothea is engaging socially. She's interested in it. She's sort of soliciting something from her grandma. Like, Grandma probably noticed that Dorothea was in a chatty mood, and sort of picked her up and started chit-chatting with her, right? And, it's a nice thing with a little glass of wine, some cake, and then Nina starts chatting and says, well, so I'll put away my cake and I'll pick up Dorothea, right? But then also what you can see is that Dorothea has developed what we would call a higher level of skill. She's now taking multiple reflexive pieces that come biologically, the ability to look at dark dots, the ability to wave your arm around, and even a newborn infant, if you put something in their hand, they'll close their fingers on it. If you put something on their foot, they'll close their toes on it, right? Those basic reflexes, which we'll study more next week, those come virtue of your genetics and your biology, but they're elicited and specialized and sort of utilized and incorporated into cognitive and emotional and social skills in the world. So that's where you start from. You start with an ability to move your hand and to close it on something. It's completely automatic. It's reflexive in Nina, right? You put something in her hand. She could be asleep. If you touch her hand, she'll go like this. But now with Dorothea can actually control this to a small extent in order to express enthusiasm when she's chit-chatting with Grandma. But only a little bit, not both, okay? And then at the same time as she's looking, she can also wave her hand around, and she can mirror her mouth and vocalize. She can do all these little pieces at once. Nina can vocalize a little bit, right? She can cry, she can make noises with her voice a little bit, but she can't do that at the same time as she's waving her arms. She's looking, so her hands are completely like just tonic. And then what happens is you start to build the component pieces together into these useful packages of pieces that then become elicited together as a package or a unit that we call a skill. And that skill is used in order to act in meaningful ways in the world. So you kind of go from biologically given reflexes, and then you develop and build those reflexes depending on how you're using them. You're coordinating them together into these more complex units that become the basis for how we learn. They are learning, really. Does that make sense? How is this maybe different or similar to how you thought about learning before and development before?
Well, just never really looked at the biological perspective of what you're born with. And, you know, it seems to be, you know, coming out of learning, we looked at a lot of social context and listed behavior, but never looking at what is already kind of innately there.
Exactly. That's a very cool perspective. Except you really notice if you have a child, I don't know what your child, you know, how that child is, but you know, if you have a child who doesn't have it innately there exactly like other people would, then all of a sudden you start to really notice, right? Before you took for granted that kids automatically do this, but no, they don't, actually. It's something that you have to come with, right? Other things? Yes?
I'm thinking, it makes sense that it happens on a continuum, but for different children, it's not on the same time continuum.
That's
And
right.
that's the part that just.
That's
kinda
right.
interesting.
There's individual variability, absolutely. And you can see the origins of cultural variability, right? And you can see how deeply culture and sort of norms and expectations and values are ingrained in not only our actions and our skills, but in our ways of thinking and in our ways of acting and in our ways of feeling, right? Our basic biological mechanisms that are being elicited in this context. Every baby around the world who's born healthy comes looking for dots, right? But then the way in which those dots, you know, kind of get tuned becomes adult norms for eye communication, for example. You know, I lived in Kenya for a while, right? And when I first got there, people, like, it just seemed like everybody's like staring at me. It's just like, okay, we don't look at people that long where I'm from, you know? And I know I'm funny looking and like all white looking or whatever, but still, we don't look at people that long. You know what I mean? And then, you know, over time I got used to it. My mom came to visit me and she was just like, well, that's pretty looking at me. You know what I mean? And then I came home and I kind of forgot and I'd sort of stare at people and they'd be like, what? And then you're like, oh, that's right, you can't do that here, right? So these things they're biologically given. You don't learn to care that somebody's looking at you. And yet, you do tune it. And that tuning becomes inherent in who you are. It really is literally tuning your biology. This is why abusive environments or neglectful environments for children are so harmful. It's because you're literally building that child's ability to engage these reflexes in a way that's going to be sort of goal-directed and purposeful in the world. And in abuse, you're severely, you know, sort of warping that trajectory. And in neglect, you're stunting it. Like one of the worst, I mean, really the worst thing you can do to a child is neglect it. I mean, I'm not advocating for abuse, don't get me wrong, okay? Please don't somebody go out and say I said that. But you know, abused kids actually can be precocious in some areas, which is not a good thing, right? They can be really great at ducking and jumping out of your way and watching what the adults around them are doing and then noticing if somebody's angry, right? They do this a lot more effectively than preschoolers, for example, who aren't abused. They also can get better verbal development very early sometimes because they learn how to say what they need to say to make sure that they, you know, get out of the way faster. They understand what somebody's going to do next. Okay, so they are actually learning things. It's just that they're learning things that don't serve them well in the more normative, adaptive context of the rest of the world. They only serve in that sort of maladaptive relationship. Whereas neglected kids just kind of stop. If you don't have the social world around you kind of pulling you along and saying, here, baby, let me show you how to be a human being, you just don't become a human being. You don't really grow in the same way. And this isn't just metaphorical. This is actually literal. One of the studies of this that I find so heartbreaking, but also so interesting from a scientific perspective is that the study by Chuck Nelson and Nathan Fox and their colleagues of institutionally raised children in Romania. Have you heard of this study? Right, so what they basically did was the MacArthur Foundation gave them funds to go to Romania and to basically train and find recruit as many foster families as they could. And then as parents were bringing their children to the institution, leaving them off to be raised there, they basically pulled their names out of a hat. And as many kids as they could, they put into foster families, and the rest of the kids stayed at the institution where their parents had left them. And they also had a biological group, a group being raised by their biological parents. And then they followed the kids over time, and what did they learn? You know, I think they expected to find that the kids raised in the institution, who, by the way, the MacArthur Foundation was supporting the institution. It was giving them food and blankets and diapers and you know, paying heating bills and stuff. So they had the physical support that they needed. They had the stuff around them that they needed. The place looks really nice when you look at the pictures. It's painted with cute elephants on the walls and stuff, right? They actually came and tried to fix it up as best they could. But what those kids don't have was, you know,